3, 2, 1.
Zero. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
In this video series we are going to explore all the commonly presented evidences to prove that the Apollo missions were a hoax. However, there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding this topic, so our job will be to separate the weak evidences from the solid evidences, or what we like to call, the real smoking guns, from the not-so-smoking guns. So join us now on this adventure, as we go into the lies which NASA has told, in order to cover up the truth which they are trying to hide from us.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
And I mean, NASA's tentacles are far-reaching. I know I read reports where people would say that we had ham radio operators 50 years ago monitoring the transmissions between NASA astronauts and, of course, Houston. Now, you know, I think most people, or a lot of people anyway, would agree when I say that if NASA wants you to hear those transmissions, you'll hear them. Otherwise, you're not going to. And I always found that a very weak argument on their point.
Actually, I've done a lot of research on this subject. This is one of my specialties, actually. Each part of the ship was transmitting its signals at a different frequency, right? There was like about, I think, a dozen different frequencies which different parts of the ships were transmitting. Those frequencies were actually coded. A non-coded frequency is called FM. As most people know, you have FM and AM radio, right?
Yeah.
So the non-coded frequencies were called FM, and the coded frequencies were called PM. So what that means is there was two sets of frequencies, one coming out and one coming in, and unless you knew the certain combination, you wouldn't be able to tap into that. So the normal public was only able to tap into the FM frequencies, okay? This is the first thing you need to know. Second thing you need to know is a ham operator would have no idea where those frequencies were coming from. They have no idea whether that signal was from a ship in low Earth orbit or a ship which is actually on the way to the moon. There's no way of knowing that with a ham radio, okay? Yeah. Now, in order to know where the actual ship is, you need to have what's known as a Doppler radar. The police check your speed with a Doppler camera, right? So in the 1960s, Doppler radar was not available to the public. No mad scientist could go to a Radio Shack and buy the equipment needed to build a Doppler radar camera. This kind of Doppler radar was only available for the military. And NASA had actually taken steps to prevent in case some mad scientist was able to get his hands on a Doppler radar. If some mad scientist had actually built himself a Doppler radar, in order to track the craft, he would actually have to go to where the NASA radars are, and he would have to set up his radar almost the same vicinity and the same direction pointing and NASA had actually blocked off a perimeter around the radar dishes where nobody could get in, okay? The third point which I would like to mention about this, in the past, if you used to look at Wikipedia, okay, Wikipedia has a famous page which they call third-party evidence for the moon landings, right?
Yeah.
They love this page, you know, and most of it is nonsense because most of it is not third-party evidence, you know. It's not. It's just puppets of NASA. So who were the ham radio operators, you know? NASA has been editing the Wikipedia page over the years. But to summarize this, one of the most famous ones, there was a guy who built some kind of a dish, and he was recording the conversation, supposedly, between Nixon and the guys on the moon, you know. So he had built this dish, and he had pointed the dish towards the moon, and he was supposedly recording this FM conversation. Now, the thing is, he only was able to record 45 minutes of the conversation, okay? And why was that? Because the conversation was not taking place on the moon. The conversation was taking place in a ship that was in low Earth orbit. So it took 45 minutes for it to pass from one horizon to the other horizon, where he was able to pick up the conversation. So actually, this is proof that they were not in the moon, you know. Otherwise, he could have just recorded many, many hours of this conversation.
So basically, once he was out of line of sight, he was not able to pick anything up. But one thing that I've noticed, and just for the viewers out there, when it comes to the hand operators, I never see a full background on any of them. Like, they're not well-known names. And it just tells me that it's a creation. It's part of the fictional narrative.
Yeah, like about 10 years ago, when I was looking for who were these ham operators, there was like an elementary school in England or something, and the teacher had a ham operator for the class. But now that's like gone. So they seem to be switching who these ham operators were. But anyway, a ham operator has a much larger field of view, right?
Yeah.
So that story I was telling you, that guy who had built his own little radar thing, that wasn't a ham thing. He was just using a FM to pick up the conversation. So that's different from a ham. A ham could have heard a lot more because his field of view is much larger. But anyway, a ham operator would not have been able to know the difference between a ship in low Earth orbit or a ship on the way to the moon. It's impossible. Whether it was a live or pre-recorded, it wouldn't have mattered, you know?
So, I mean, the official versions, let's just talk about Apollo 11, and the official version says basically, and this is just a basic outline, when they're on the lunar surface and they were communicating to Houston Control, it was, if I'm not mistaken, I know I wrote about this, just the official version I'm talking about, that the transmission was sent to a satellite, then it was sent to Australia, the monitoring facilities there, and then from there it was beamed back up to the satellite and then to Houston, and then Houston prepared it and sent it out to the public. That's just a bare description of what the official version says. But in my mind, when I was hearing that, a ham operator can be allowed to pick that up to give the impression that this is live from the lunar surface. But the argument from the proponents is that, well, they have proof because ham operators picked up that signal. Well, even the official version tells you that that's not true. He's not picking up a signal from the moon directly. He's picking it up from Houston when they send that out. Not exactly clear on the details, but it's definitely not proof that they were hearing a signal from the lunar surface. They have no proof of that. There's no way that they could substantiate that, correct?
Correct. There's no way they could know where that signal's coming from.
Yeah.
Not without a Doppler radar. So one of the things I like to talk about is not so much how can we prove this thing is a hoax, but rather I like to talk about how did they pull it off? You see, this is the big question on my mind. How did they fool thousands of scientists, you know? And so what they did was they had the astronauts in the low Earth orbit, you know, and they were recording the entire conversation. You can listen to the entire audios of or however many days the mission was. They were doing this live chitter-chatting, right? And, you know, they were reading off scripts, you know, like, oh, at certain point, you're supposed to do this, and at certain point, you're supposed to do that. And so they were both reading off scripts. But then when it comes to the actual lunar surface, now we're transmitting live from the lunar surface. So you have the live audio streaming the entire mission, and then at certain points they went live with video as well. So on those live with videos, of course, they're obviously just in low Earth orbit. You can even see the blue light coming in the windows from the Earth glare. But then they supposedly did live from the lunar surface, and that is, of course, just pre-recorded clips that they were playing back. Okay, now we're live from the moon, but this is just actually something they recorded in a studio earlier, and nobody would have known the difference. So that's how they did it. They just switched between live audio and then this pre-recorded video clips, and then they would switch back to the live audio.
That's a good point, because you're talking about low Earth orbit. We've seen some of the film footage that Bart Sabril has put out that he was sent by an insider or a whistleblower, if I can put it that way. Do you not find it strange that NASA didn't think to block out the blue light coming from the Earth when they're supposedly It's halfway to the moon.
There's an excuse for this. Okay, there's a NASA excuse for this. So I haven't actually heard them say this, but I'm sure that if they were to give an answer, this would be the answer. They would say, oh, this is due to the window tint. So what they did was, if you look at the surface photos, when they get out of the ship and then they come back and they snap a photo of the ship, you see this bright blue glare coming off of the windows, and they say that's the tint of the UV protection, and things like that. The problem is it's only there in some of the photos and it's not there in other photos. And what's even more funny is that you have live video inside the craft, and then 1 minute you see, okay, live video feed, and there's a blue glare coming from the windows, and then all of a sudden there's a live video feed coming from the lunar surface, and then there's no more blue glare coming in the windows. The tint is somehow gone,
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. And there's so many funny things you can find like this, like I think on Apollo 11 where Buzz Aldrin's coming down the ladder, and in one of the photos, the light inside the LEM, they left the light on, and then in the next photo, it's like the light's not on anymore. It's like, what, did you climb back up the ladder and turn off the light? You could go on and on, Right now I have this list, which I call the 12 smoking guns. These are what I found to be the strongest arguments.
You sent that list to me, and that is a list that we can definitely touch on in subsequent videos coming up.
Yeah, I want to do maybe even a whole video series on this because these points are so important. But what I was just trying to say is, right now I have a list of 12 smoking guns because these are the strongest ones. But don't stop there. There's so many others, which I could go on about. There's another funny one just to throw in. I call this point number 13. There's one photo which has no crosshairs. None. If you just look at the entire roll of film, there's one photo where there's no crosshairs. And I came across that, and I'm like, what? What is NASA's excuse for that? How could it be just one photo out of the whole roll with no crosshairs? So the NASA excuse is somehow Buzz Aldrin climbed back into the ship, and then he took out the film roll from one camera, and he happened to have another camera with no crosshairs, and he put the film in that camera. He snapped one picture, and then he took the film roll out of that, put it back into the camera which had the crosshairs. This is the official NASA story, It
does take you in many different directions. There's one last point I just want to bring up. You were talking earlier about mission control and the behavior. They're descending the ladder to the moon, their heartbeat is racing, and we're monitoring this, and that's all, of course, part of the narrative to get people, they want to hear this, and they think, oh, it's real. So I had an interesting back and forth with a proponent of the missions, and he was talking about analyzing. He apparently is in some kind of behavior career where it involves analyzing people's behavior. And he was talking about, well, what I'm going to do is analyze the voice recordings of the astronauts, and I might be able to tell whether their behavior was real as depicted by the official version. And I got to thinking this, that is not a valid argument, because I know that from my own flight training, when I had to do sessions in the simulator, my mind puts me in the aircraft. Your brain does that. It puts you in the aircraft, and you have the corresponding anatomical responses to a situation that would be created for you in the flight deck. So, for example, they may create, okay, you have an engine failure. The computer is programmed to give me an engine failure. My heartbeat starts racing, and I'm in a simulator, safe and sound on the ground. But in my mind, my brain thinks I'm in the aircraft, and my blood pressure is going up because I have to make sure I make that field. I got to land this plane safely. So his argument kind of fell flat when I told him that. I said, well, I have those responses in a simulator, and I'm not even in an aircraft. So the responses that I'm having in a simulator are exactly the same as the responses I would be having in terms of behavior in an actual real-life situation.
Let me just add one last point here. As I mentioned earlier, American Moon found 3 examples of where the time delay was lacking. And I want to explain this because maybe a lot of people don't really understand this point. So the 3-second time delay has to come between when Houston says something and when the moon replies. It can only be there, you know. If the moon says something, Houston can reply immediately. But if Houston says something, it takes 1.6 seconds to reach the moon, 1.6 seconds to come back. So that delay has to be there. And unfortunately, on American Moon, they had found 3 examples, and they don't tell us where these 3 examples come from. You know, I gave you my list of 12 smoking guns, and that's one of the main things here, is if you find a smoking gun, please tell us where you found it, you know, what mission, where. That's one of the main things on my list now, is I'm finally giving everybody a list of where you can actually find these things. One of the big ones is this lack of time delay. You know, like I said, the American Moon blog, which used to be a blog, I guess is now gone. There was a big debate, and NASA was sending in trolls trying to debunk them. And NASA has been trying to do damage control, trying to fix those missing delay times. But I found my own examples of where the delay is lacking, and that is on the rover ride of Apollo 15.
Dave, we want you to head towards Station 4, and we'll advise you on what your rate looks like and the tasks that we want you to carry out once you arrive. Just start off in the direction of Station 4, please.
Okay, give me a heading. I can see it over there, Dave, yeah. It's about 330. But that's not going to mean much to you until you get down to the level. That's right. And the camera's running, Joe.
Okay, and standing by for a mark when you roll.
We're rolling.
Roger.
Hey, your camera. Camera's loose on a swivel, Jim. No, I'm feeling my pan here. Oh, really? Oh, it's an awful fast pan. I just wanted to make sure it was running.
Dave, you'll want to trend or course 346, and it's about 1.7 clicks to station.
Okay. I'm going to go down sort of slow here, Joe. Just to make sure we play it cool. Well, I just have the camera running, Joe. Remind me to turn it off when it runs out of film.
Yes, sir, I've got a hack.
About half a mag on it.
Roger. And you're running at 12 frames per second, I imagine.
Yeah. Right. But we're going down sun, right? Yes, sir. Down sun ain't going to be very good on the photography, Joe. The zero phase just washes out completely.
No problem, Dave. Jim might want to swing the camera around towards the right.
Well, we're heading directly downhill now. We're cross sun.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking out at the, are we looking at the big crater dead ahead? Is Dune, yeah. Yeah, that should be Dune.
It's just full of those lacking delays. And there's more. There's more. On Apollo 16, Apollo 17, I've heard them, but I haven't yet listed. In the future, I plan on giving a list of where all these lacking time delays are, which mission, at what timestamp. And also one last thing, supposedly what I remember from the American Moon blog is they were also editing the time. You have the entire audio transmission. They had typed that whole thing up, and they had put in the timestamps for every word, every reply. And NASA has been editing those because those also supposedly showed that the time delay was missing. So that used to be on the American blog where they were busting NASA at editing not only the videos, but also editing the sheets, which had all the audio communications timestamps. For me, this project is just beginning. There's so much more work that needs to be done. And I keep asking in my group, I said, does anybody have any free time on your hands? Actually, I have 3 jobs and spend all my time kicking out trolls from the group. I've been running this Facebook group since 2008. And, I've been aware of all the psyops, it was like First was the Stanley Kubrick filmed it, and then there was the so-called Stanley Kubrick confession video, the guy who was pretending to be Stanley. I just was saying that, I have a lot of stories to tell, a lot of research on this, and my own personal story, because I am a whistleblower. I do have access to insider information that this thing was a hoax. So hopefully, we can talk more about that in the future.